I'd like to say a very good morning and welcome to DROP's webinar on Afghanistan-India prospects and challenges towards cooperation and towards cooperation on security and peace. We are very thrilled to have with us a very distinguished group of panelists. We have with us Ambassador Sinha, former Secretary of External Affairs, India. We have with us Dr. Salma Malik, Assistant Professor at Quaid-e-Azam University, Pakistan. Mr. Abbas Faraso, former Chargé Affairs at Afghanistan Embassy, Australia. And Ms. Shugra Azizi, DROP's journal author in the 5th volume of our Women in Politics journal that focused on fostering a regional consensus towards security in Afghanistan, and in which she wrote a very in-depth research paper on Kabul-New Delhi security relations. We're very thrilled, and we'd like to thank you all for being here with us today. I would like to, it is particularly my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's event, Ms. Rajeshwari Krishnamurthy, who is the Deputy Director at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies in New Delhi. Her research focuses on issues in foreign policy and international security, such as armed conflict, peace processes, rule of law, political stability, geopolitics, and grand strategy in South Asia, and where relevant, Central and West Asia. I'd like to thank you, Rajeshwari, for moderating today's session. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over the panel to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. It's always a great pleasure to be part of DROP's activities in whatever form. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and any other greeting that might be applicable since there are 5 time zones here. Welcome. I would like to begin by thanking the DROP's team, Mariam, Bismillah, Khushan, Sabah, and the others for organizing today's very timely conversation. I would also like to thank all our panelists, Ambassador Sinha, Dr. Malik, Mr. Farasu, and Ms. Azizi for making time for today's discussion. I understand it is, it might not have been easy to sort of coordinate all the time zones and make oneself available, but it has happened. So I'm very grateful for the fact that it has come together. But today's cross-section, what we can is that our panelists also represent a cross-section which speaks to the interdisciplinarity of the conversations and insights that can be expected of this webinar, and which is necessary for the topic as well as in general for any conversation that has to do with international relations, politics, diplomacy, security, and so on and so forth. So Ambassador Sinha, I mean, the introductions are all done, so I'll keep my remarks very brief. So Ambassador Sinha, it's great to see you again and to share a table with you again after March this year. Dr. Malik, it's great to speak with you again, and we just discussed how it's been 6 years since we actually met in Delhi. Welcome to the conversation. Mr. Farasu, it's lovely to have you here, and Shugra, it's really great to meet you after getting to know you through your essay in the 5th volume. Our panelists today, I don't think need any introduction or context for the conversation or the topic in general, but let me just sort of say a couple of sentences and we can have the conversation proceed. As you all know, India-Afghanistan relations do have a very long history and a rather eventful one spanning time and space. However, today's conversation, of course, pertains to the present and the future of this relationship and related expectations from all those involved. Needless to say, of course, any conversation on India-Afghanistan relations cannot be complete without a conversation on and with our common neighbor, Pakistan. So as such, today might be among the few occasions where we have perspectives from all 3 on a table set for the 3. And crucially, of course, today's conversation comes at an important time in and for Afghanistan, and it is Afghanistan and the Afghan people who will experience the effects of the unfolding developments most acutely. Therefore, before we begin, I would like to apologize to DROPS because I'm taking the liberty to flip the speaker sequence so that we can begin with our Afghan speakers first, followed by Ambassador Sinha, and then Dr. Malik before we proceed to the Q&A. I hope that's all right. Mr. Farasu, the floor is all yours.
Oh, thank you. I was thinking I was the second or third one. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's a very timely webinar. So I do want to give you a context for what we have between Afghanistan and India. So those informations are all available. I would like to look at the bilateral relation through a security perspective and the context of current peace process and also the current conflict, and also the dimension of this conflict that we have in Afghanistan as basically it's a proxy war in Afghanistan. So what is the what is the challenge, and what is the what India and Afghanistan can do together in this context? So that's the my approach to the topic today, and it's very timely, this context that we have today in Afghanistan and in the region. So if make it simple, my argument is that Afghanistan and India bilateral relationship is it depends on current peace process, and what we have at the end of the day through Afghan intra talks, that can define the future of our relationship, and also define the challenge that we will have in the future, and also it determine what both country can do right now. So I think we can think about in this context, we can think about at least five scenarios in the current context that we have both peace process at the same time. There's violence going on, and basically the wars going on, and we have last week we had the issue in Helmand province. So the violence still is high. So there's no substantive level of reduction in violence in Afghanistan that can also undermine the peace process. So there's we at least think about, I think, five scenarios. And then, based on these five scenarios, we can assess the Afghanistan-India relationship in the context of current political development and also in the future. So, first, if contextualize what we have today based on what we had in 1990s and before that, and the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan, so we can assess these five scenarios in that context. The first one is different scenarios of strategic ambition related to Afghanistan in this war. The first one is the maximum level of strategic ambition in this war, which we have in the context of proxy war. The Taliban have sanctuaries and support from Pakistan, and in the past it was somehow a covert relationship, but now it's already an overt relationship, and since 2018 and the negotiation between the Taliban and the US, then all these things are not anymore covered. So the maximum levels of this ambition is to actually control Afghan politics through overthrowing the current government, or bringing Taliban in the power through violence or a sort of peace process that Taliban can lead the peace process and can own this peace process. And as we know, the Afghan government was marginalized in the peace process, and currently Taliban insisting on their own terms, and there is no concession to go forward. So that's the maximum level of strategic ambition. And the second one is the medium level, which is kind of balancing strategy from within Afghanistan. But it can be in two different directions. The first one is creating a balance within the Afghan government. This version is balance and integrative balance. The Taliban come to the government, but changing the political system based on their own version, which is the Islamic Emirate, or under some other name, but still the combination and the elements can be quite similar with the Islamic Emirate, that can provide a ground level of legitimacy for the Taliban to have upper hand in the country. And that will change the whole political landscape of the country. And that will have a huge impact on India-Afghanistan relationship. Just you can imagine about the Taliban fighters and other institutions such as the whole political system and a high centralized political system and judiciary system and legislative system. Taliban, if come to religious legitimacy, something close to the current Islamic Emirate version that we have, that version will give a grand level of religious legitimacy for them to control all these institutions gradually or through types of peace agreement. And the third scenario is a minimum internal balance, which can be parallel or separate. De facto, it does exist through territorial control in different parts of Afghanistan. Imagine if there is ceasefire, then that is a process of legitimization of this parallel balance in Afghanistan. We have different cases in the Middle East in the context of proxy wars, but we don't have any political platform for that to officially recognize that and provide a grand levels of legitimacy for that. And that's the minimum levels of balance. I think in the context of regional security rivalries and also proxy relation, Pakistan already have achieved that levels of internal balancing de facto. So the fourth scenario can be the failure of peace process and a total civil war in the country, which can lead to a total chaos, and that's another security and strategic implication and can impact the Afghan-India relationship in the future. And the fourth one is enduring peace agreement that can bring all actors together in a democratic setup. That can be an ideal scenario to the current peace process that will have a positive impact on India-Afghanistan relationship to go forward with securing current achievements, current relationship, and also define a clear pathway for the future to enhance the bilateral relationship and development projects and other things that we have today in Afghanistan between India and Afghanistan. So the question now is, considering this challenge that we have in the context of war and peace process, what India-Afghanistan can do in this context? So I will briefly highlight and then we'll give you more details during the Q&A session, I think. The first one is, I think the very immediate one is the avoid the collapse of institutional collapse, financial collapse, and security collapse. Because currently, the kinds of psychology created that the Taliban have upper hand on the negotiation table and also on the ground. And that will lead to a different scenario. So Afghanistan, Pakistan have this challenge now to how to avoid the kinds of potential collapse. And also India can have the power for international mobilization. And also we know India will be UN Security Council member in 2021 and 2022. And also at the regional level, India can play a bigger role. And also India can play a bigger role in the region to somehow, similar to platform that we have had like a Heart of Asia process or Istanbul process, to that kinds of platform in the region to engagement, to enforce the de-secretization process at the regional level related to Afghanistan issue, which is a central discussion or dialogue with Pakistan and that level to desecretize the engagement of different countries in the region, including India itself and Pakistan. In that case, that's a way forward to build regional consensus, and that's important and crucial for the current peace process and also the future of Afghanistan-India relationship. I would like to stop here and we'll give you more details in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Perfect. Could I thank you, Mr. Farasu, for that overview and for positing the scenarios that may not sort of unfold and what might happen depending on which scenario unfolds. May I now? All right. So Ambassador Sinha has volunteered to go last. So may I ask Dr. Malik to present her remarks? I'm sorry, I'm mixing it up big time, the sequence. But if that's all right with you, would you like to sort of make your remarks?
Rajeshwari, you're too polite to be rude. So, and this is a massive offensive that you have launched against Pakistan. In any case, I'm grossly outnumbered. But what are friends for? Okay.
How is that?
Having said that, it's so good to see both my beautiful friends together on a platform. So I'm so happy. Thank you very much, Drops, Mariam, and Rajeshwari for inviting me to this panel. Usually when it comes to this triadal relation between India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, Pakistan always sticks out as the villain of the story. And it's usually all the wrong things that have happened in the region is because of Pakistan. But you see, and of course, being a Pakistani, I'm not here going to take a defensive line, but what I'm going to say is that every country does what they do for their best of interest. And what India would do may not be looked favorably by Pakistan, what Pakistan may do may not be looked favorably upon by India or Afghanistan, what Afghanistan does. So every country is looking after their self-interest and how they interpret those self-interest. However, this is no justification for any aspect, and I'm not speaking as a government agent here. I'm an academic per se. And contrary to the popular opinion that we have, and that has been really hammered home and established, Pakistan and Afghanistan do have relations that predate the Taliban's entry into this particular situation. And unfortunately, Taliban as an element are somewhat a very unfortunate consequence of a conflict that had prevailed for the longest time in a country with extreme shades of culture, ethnic tones, and so many things that had happened. And the last aspect into the Afghan story, before the creation, so-called creation of the Taliban, of course, were the Mujahideen, who were hailed worldwide as God's gift to planet Earth, and a lot of myth creation around them that they were instrumental in crushing the evil the red evil Soviets, and these things prevailed. Now, this was the flavor of the 1980s, and it worked. What all the creators, including Pakistan, the US, everyone, and I would not say with due respect and reservations that I have, that there were not Afghan stakeholders who did not consider this to be a viable agency and a way to fight against the Soviet entry and occupation. What technically happened was that there was an indigenous resistance against the Soviet entry into Afghanistan, and external actors, including Pakistan and the US, provided it credence, and the situation around Pakistan at that time having a military government further enabled this. The rest is history. It's a very long story. But the fact is, it created three things. Number one, it created space for an extremist element, not only in Afghanistan, even in Pakistan and other areas where this particular mixing of violence, religion, and politics was considered to be a potent force when it came to fighting off when it came to resistance against oppression or against any type of occupation. One aspect. It has several consequences to it, and from case to case, this may differ. However, the consequence for Afghanistan later on, very generically, in a sweeping manner, turned out to be the Taliban. And I'll stop at this point. Going back between Pakistan and Afghanistan, another massive development was the inflow of a huge number of Afghan nationals who either transited via Pakistan to Western capitals and settled abroad, and many of them are now back in Afghanistan as the vibrant, young, very dynamic civil society which has tried its very best, and one really hopes and prays that they prevail in creating the dream Afghanistan that they aim to create. The second aspect was that a big number of Afghan nationals remained back in Pakistan and were either absorbed in the refugee camps, and they were quantified, they were numbered, they were given refugee cards by the UNHCR under all the international parameters. But at the same time, a sufficient number, an equally large number, somehow diffused into the Pakistani demography. And now they hold Pakistani cards and everything. So they have another identity. And it's very difficult given that Pakistan is also not exactly a very highly developed country. It's a third world country with its very acute economic and governance challenges. So one needs to give a country such as ours that particular space, which has not been accorded to it. The refugees or the Afghan nationals, if one may call it, many of them went back to their country. But unfortunately, number one, Afghanistan does not have so much of space to accommodate a heavy inflow of population groups. And a second aspect is that many of the Afghan nationals who have been brought up in Pakistan don't know Afghanistan. They have this vague identity and affiliation, and a very strong affiliation with a country called Afghanistan, but they were born here. In fact, in certain cases, even their parents were born in Pakistan. So this is a very strange mix of situation and a very unfortunate situation, because these are stateless people in a certain sense, if one may call them, who are considered as Afghan nationals in Pakistan, but they don't have any physical presence, space, or even a right to vote in their own parent country. And the dynamics are very complex, and there's a very genuine reason behind why all this is happening. But of course, as the Afghan society and the state develops further, inshallah, hopefully, these problems would also be looked into. But Pakistan and Afghanistan, from day one, from the creation of the state of Pakistan, have had troubled relations. The Durand Line, the issue about recognizing Pakistan as a state, Afghanistan delaying that decision, the Pashtunistan issue, all of these created a massive trust deficit on both sides. And this trust deficit and this particular phenomenon was exploited by all stakeholders who were interested in exploiting the situation. And added to that is the final nail in the coffin, the Taliban situation. Now, where does this stand? I would just continue from where we were talking. Do I still have my turn, or has...
Yes, you do.
Cyber started. Okay. So very quickly, I'm eating up on the time. So what I technically was saying, thank you so much, Ambassador Sir. What I technically was saying was that this new generation of Taliban are a very different animal from the previous generation. And I would actually say that this is a new generation. It's a second generation. The previous generation was quite much dependent on Pakistan, but once they came into power, once they realized the political they gained the political power that they had in Kabul, any type of negotiations that they did with Pakistan was as an equal partner, not contrary to the popular opinion as subservience or someone who had created them. There is this Afghan tradition of being extremely autonomous and independent, and the Taliban had a similar notion. Despite all those ethnic links and the evil pair that had come together, so that was not happening here. Yet this particular generation that is now trying to come into power is a generation which is different from its predecessor for several reasons. After long war, there are hardened people who have managed to claim a sufficient amount of land and territory. And what they know, and they have this arrogance about them, is that despite the world's biggest powers Afghanistan for over a decade, no one could break that stronghold from them. So they have this confidence, number one. Number two, of course, is that after having this long battle of nerves and narratives and everything, at the end of the day, blame it on Pakistan, which would be a wrong blame. Pakistan tried to facilitate the Murray process and the Bourbon process and this process and that process. Many of the international players in the game negotiated with two parties. One, the legitimate Afghan government of the day sitting in Kabul, and the second party were the Taliban. Because everyone realized that whether they like the Taliban or not, they are a people who need to be negotiated with because they carry that nuisance value around them. And ultimately, the Doha process unfortunately ended up proving precisely that. As a Pakistani, and I'm honestly not saying it because I'm speaking on a neutral platform, there's huge concern in the civil society and concerned quarters as to what happens when this generation of Taliban, hypothetically, if they come into a dominant power arrangement or a complete government, how is it going to work between the two countries? Because as we would tend to believe that the Taliban would listen to everything Pakistan says, that would not be the case. They are Afghans in the first instance. The second aspect is that the Taliban are also a very prudent economic animal. So they are going to see to it that any of the economic programs that the great powers are bringing to this region work. And for that, I would actually say to India that if India pitches a good economic program, I'm pretty sure the Taliban are going to be willing to negotiate with them. They're very, very democratic and secular when it comes to this. The Sharia and everything is for domestic consumption, and because that sets them apart from the secular actors. Now, what is wrong with this picture? The main issue that is wrong with this picture is that this very fragilely, very precariously maintained civil society space in which young people, such as what we see on the Afghan Fora now, is going to undergo a massive challenge. How much space would they have in a Taliban-dominated / Taliban-led future scenario? Next to minimal. Would they give enough space to women during Pakbosh conferences, Doha negotiations? The Taliban leadership has been extremely careful in crafting in the letters that they have mailed in the New York Times and all about the role of women, where the Dukhtaran and the sisters would be in the power sharing mechanism. But to my limited understanding, it's just going to be that, nothing more. It is not going to translate into reality. And Taliban leadership has indicated as much. The Mehram story and Akhi sitting next to the Dukhtar and all of that stuff, it's going to boil down back to that. And what is going to make the situation worse is that now they have the confidence that the international powers, not Pakistan, not Saudi Arabia, not UAE, but international powers as strong as the USA, Russia, China, have all agreed to have the Taliban as the main stakeholder, with the legitimate Afghan government in Kabul as Team B. And my apologies if I sound too blunt and rude here. And that further weakens this precarious foundation of a modern liberal Afghan society and governance structure that is trying to come up and gather strength and hold. Would they negotiate with Pakistan? They would negotiate from a position of not only strength, which is not a bad idea, but arrogance. And this arrogance is going to seep into every decision making that they do. How would that bode well or poorly with the region? You bring a good economic prospect, that would work. You listen and you talk to them in their language, that might work. Would Pakistan have any push and pull with the Taliban? Not 100%, minimal to a friendly situation, depending on how well we have created any linkages there. Pakistan deeply supports a multi-party and a all-inclusive approach to the future of Afghanistan. And Abdullah Saab's visit to Pakistan was an indicator of that. Can Pakistan do anything? The CPEC, which is again a very controversial prospect. Let's try, hypothetically, for the sake of regional prosperity, not look at CPEC from a political lens, but a purely economic lens as a development phenomenon which doesn't run vertically alone, but it can work horizontally as well. And if in an alternate universe, all of these countries realize the combined potential of economic cooperation, then all of these points of contention can actually be worked for the betterment and cooperative model in South Asia, where the CPEC, the Gwadar, the Chabahar, and the BRI linkages that run through India and Bangladesh can all be part of a larger network and build to the prosperity and economic uplift of a region which desperately needs that. I would just stop here. I know this is a very wishful and a nice presentation, but this is how I feel, that this is not something that cannot be worked, but it is very much possible. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rajeshwari.
Thank you, Dr. Malik. That was a very nice broad sweep of things as they were, as they stand, and what could be if, if the will and, what do you call it, foresight is applied. Thank you very much for that, for a very frank point of view. Sugra, could you quickly deliver your remarks before we then move on to Ambassador Sinha?
Okay. Sure. Thank you, everyone. So good evening, Ms. Rajeshwari, respected ambassador, honorable panelists, and Ms. Safi. It's a great honor for me having the opportunity to speak in this conference. The paper I published in Drops Journal is titled Kabul-New Delhi Relations and the Future of Security in Afghanistan. In this paper, I have divided my discussion into four major parts, which I will talk on each individual of them briefly here. So my discussion starts with focusing on the areas of cooperation between India and Afghanistan. India has helped Afghanistan in different sectors and development projects such as industry, irrigation, hydroelectric projects, and importantly in defense and military support. India-Afghanistan relations have been friendly since the early years of Indian independence, and by signing the bilateral friendship treaty in 1950. India has also invested in several development projects in Afghanistan after the fall of Taliban regime and also in the recent years. These projects have helped Afghanistan a lot to improve its economy and to be less dependent on its neighbors. So building the dams on Kabul River, we can say, is one of those examples. Coming to the next part of my discussion, which is about India's stake and interest in Afghanistan, I argue in my paper that India pursues closer and friendly relations with Afghanistan for several reasons. Countering Pakistan influence is certainly one of them, but Delhi also pursues another range of interest in Afghanistan, and it is having access to energy-rich Central Asia. However, I think India's most fundamental stake in Afghanistan is to prevent Afghanistan from being used as a safe haven for terrorists that they plan terrorist attacks in India. So while the expansion of India's presence in Afghanistan benefit Afghanistan on one hand, it also raises some serious concerns in Pakistan, because Pakistan considers any Indian influence in Afghanistan as a threat to their country. And this is because in the past, when India cooperated with Afghanistan on several occasions, it caused Pakistan's influence got limited in Afghanistan. So as example, we can mention the Chabahar port that was supported by India, and they have invested on that. Regarding India's concerns in its foreign policy when it comes to Afghanistan, as I mentioned earlier, India's biggest concern is Afghanistan being used as a safe haven for terrorists that pose challenges to India's security. So for this paper and for my own research, I also interviewed Ms. Shahzad Akbar, a former adjunct professor at the American University of Afghanistan, on this topic, and she stated that India is interested in peace and stability in Afghanistan because they don't want Afghanistan to be a safe haven for terrorists. Since India has economic investment in Afghanistan and they try to develop a strong relationship with a country with a stable state in Afghanistan, so that India can benefit from this relationship economically in long term. Lastly, in regards to India's cooperation in Afghanistan security and peace, India has showed interest always in stabilizing Afghanistan by helping Afghanistan to empower its armed forces to become self-sufficient and less dependent on foreign supports. However, we think Afghanistan needs more of such supports from India. Regarding the Afghanistan peace and security, India with its support and influence in the region and as a member of several multilateral platforms such as Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SAARC, and the Kabul process can encourage the countries both in Central Asia and South Asia to cooperate with Afghanistan in facilitating security in Afghanistan. Because security and peace in Afghanistan help the security in the region, because Afghanistan will cease to be a safe haven for terrorist groups. And it also provides opportunities for India's further investment and commerce. In addition to this, as Dr. Malik also mentioned, the contentious relationship that India and Pakistan they have, India can contribute to the regional consensus on security and peace in Afghanistan by assuring Pakistan that India's presence in Afghanistan will not pose any threat to them, and this can be done through engaging in friendly talks and conversation with Pakistan on this topic. So this was all the summary of my research and the paper that I published in Drops journal. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time and listening.
Thank you, Subra. That was succinct and brief, and thank you very much for being here and speaking on this topic today. Master Sinha, may I request you to deliver your remarks?
Thank you. Thank you, Rajeshwari. I don't know where to start. Of course, a lot of comments I could, but let me begin by the first remark of Dr. Malik, where you said that you have started an offensive against Pakistan. So I want to start with an assurance that no, I don't think either us, because two of us are from India, or perhaps the organizers, Mariam Sufi, etc., had thought of it as an offensive. I think the idea was, and that's why a small group, to really talk about how we look at it. I'm sure there will be convergences. There are differences between India and Pakistan. Should that shadow be allowed to fall on Afghanistan and the Afghanistan peace process? So these are the issues that I would like to address slightly later. Let me quickly address, since they sent me questions, that how you describe security cooperation between India and Afghanistan, existing challenges, what role in facilitating sustainable peace, and of course, lastly, also, how does India-Pakistan rivalry affect Afghan peace process? So let me briefly address some of these are factual questions, and use the benefit of my having served in Afghanistan. You see, I see that our defense and security current level of relationship, I think they are very well, one thing you'll all have to remember that India and Afghanistan doesn't have a combatant role. That role is given to NATO and ISAF. So we are, as a regional and a neighbor, that we are assisting Afghanistan bilaterally. though despite having a non-combatant role, we also have to bear in mind that India is perhaps one of the countries which has lost largest number of lives. In fact, more than perhaps some of the NATO countries in Afghanistan, while implementing the various projects, etc., including some of our diplomats. But in our defense cooperation, I think it is a very robust and healthy relationship. It is need-based. It fills in the gaps that Afghan security forces have in their ability to fight the insurgency. And I say we only fill in the gaps basically because we also realize that NATO has the primary responsibility to equip and maintain and train the Afghan forces. So we have not only trained the people who are in the main fighting arm of the Afghan Defense Forces, but also the peripherals, which support the fighting force, such as the doctors, the paramedics, the logistics people, the transport people. So we have assisted them. We have also assisted them with transportation. Only recently, the fact that Afghan security forces were facing a major challenge in terms of counter-attacking India, I think for the first time, very visibly contributed 6 or 8 attack helicopters, which also faces certain problems from the NATO countries who control the airspace and who control what they call the Tashkil or something. We train, if you look at our defense institutions, whether it's the National Defense Academy or the IMA, Afghan contingent forms the largest contingent from any country or anywhere in the world. Nepal is there, Tajikistan is there, but so we train over 1,000 Afghan security forces each year in very specialized operation, which includes counterinsurgency, mountain warfare, counterterrorism, bomb disposal, and all sorts of things. So basically it focuses on enhancing domestic capabilities of Afghan security forces to be a credible force for the protection of its own people and protection of its own country. In terms of offensive capabilities, I don't think India has given that. And that, I must say, to a very large extent, is also shows a certain sensitivity towards how Pakistan will view it. Because even without that, we are charged that we are sort of colluding with Afghanistan, etc., etc. And not by you, Dr. Malik, at other forums also, we have heard that, and very serious allegations are made. But we have shown a certain sensitivity, much to the annoyance of Afghans who have signed their first strategic partnership with India, etc. And both at the policy level, while we tend to do as much as possible, but we also tend to moderate, looking at the regional complexities. Similarly, we have strong cooperation in intelligence sharing. That means enhancing the capabilities of NDS, because one thing is fighting, but the other is if we can prevent the attacks that happen, which takes a large toll on Afghan civilian population. Then the next question was, what are the current challenges? Well, if I look at it differently, the challenges first, I would say, would be perhaps the capabilities of Indian defense manufacturing sector. Can it meet all the Afghan requirements? I don't think it can. But then add to that the other complexities, which is the international presence in Afghanistan, which limits the role of other countries, which are non-combatants. Because since NATO controls everything, even if you gave equipment to Afghanistan security forces, they will not be able to use it because it's not brought onto the Tashkil. And since it is paid for by Americans, so if the helicopters we gave, suppose the Americans did not authorize the fuel for it, it will be useless. So that is a limiting factor. Then, of course, US policies, which at times all of us would agree that at times are very contradictory. Objectives that it seeks in Afghanistan seems to get contradicted by its own policies towards Iran or even Russia, etc., which limits its maneuverability. So US policies towards Russia, China, and the region is a complicating factor, because even attempts for us, suppose something that we can't supply to Afghan forces, we did offer that we will buy it from Russia. But then the US sanctions made sure that we could not buy any Russian equipment and give it to Afghanistan. So that is another complicating factor, because a large part of Indian defense manufacture are under license from Russia, and which by definition, because of the sanctions, cannot be transferred to Afghanistan under the current conditions. Uh, uh, and of course, and that is why when I said that the equipment, etc., that we have provided, we have made sure that it is not seen as India's intention to push Afghanistan beyond its own border. So we have catered to their defensive requirements, not to their offensive requirements, which I mentioned. Then, of course, in terms of training, the other limiting factor is the level of violence itself and the conditions, because you cannot really train a lot of Afghan soldiers because of the level of violence and the engagements that the military forces don't have the capacity to release people to go for trainings. They are on fighting all 24/7 really in all the provinces. So that is a major limitation. We could have overcome that if we could have created in situ training facilities, but I think the security conditions don't preclude that option. So in situ training is not possible. Then we have also looked at regional options, whether we can train them in neighboring countries. But the same issue of sparing the capacities in Afghan forces comes to the fore. Then the other assistance that we have given is immediate medical relief and assistance. While the injured on the battlefield are treated in Afghanistan, but some of the specialized treatment, whether lose a limb or artificial transplantation is supposed to be done, or reconstructive surgery is done, then we have provided a large number of slots in our own facilities where they can be airlifted and trained. And very importantly, we have also tried to help the children of the Afghan security forces martyrs. We had, in fact, when PM Modi had come there in 2015, and I must claim credit for that idea, that we had said that we will help the youngsters, because they are all, many of them are left in single parent homes with just mothers to support them, with no financial institutions. So to help them, because our scholarships focus on the graduate and postgraduate studies, but nobody cared about the school children. How will they go to school? They'll never qualify to go to a college. So we thought that we will at least help these children of the martyrs. And we're looking at a partner in Afghanistan which could help do that with a foundation. I am sure, of course, I left Afghanistan 3 years ago. I'm sure something would have come in place, but I'm not really sure right now. Then what can India do? I think in support of Doha process. You see, despite our misgivings about the agreement, and there are many critiques, I personally have critiqued that agreement because we feel that it is very one-sided. It has given a premature legitimacy to Taliban. It has actually prioritized the Taliban over Afghan government, which you also mentioned that some people consider Afghan government as Team B. I don't think India has come to that position yet. What India has done really is it has followed a step behind the Afghan public opinion. And because that is, I think, what India's constituency is, that is where we have earned goodwill, we have equities. And I don't think it was necessary for us to start hedging bets or jumping board and getting onto the Taliban bandwagons as if that's the new rock star on the scene. We don't think that is that. I personally also don't feel that it will be a Taliban-led Afghanistan that we are going to look for in the future. Not because we don't want it, because not only first a throwback to Emirates, I can tell you straight away, is not acceptable to anybody except for Taliban. I don't think it is acceptable even to Pakistan. But definitely I can tell you it's not acceptable to the EU, not to India, not to Iran, not to China, not to Russia. It's not going to happen. So I think that message should be very clear to Taliban. It should also be very clear that all the hosting that they saw in various foreign offices before Doha agreement was not giving them a blank check that they can run amok. Because already in 1 month, you can see that the mood is changing. People are realizing that they have given away too much, and Taliban has no incentive to reduce the violence levels, which is happening with absolutely sickening regularity. And they have added another element of targeted killing in the urban areas, which also we can see that it's a very pernicious development. So supporting Doha process, and I think keeping the Afghan political leadership together is perhaps the best role India can play, given our equities and our friendships and our goodwill across political parties, cutting across ethnic lines. I think India should help both as a country and also as the UN Security Council to be apprising the global opinion of how we see the ground reality evolving, and what is it that we expect from Taliban. We should be telling them, expect from Taliban in terms of how they need to moderate themselves, what of their demands are completely illegitimate and unacceptable. Unacceptable because people of Afghanistan will not accept it. And in fact, I don't know if you've seen, there was a Heart of Asia Society survey done 15 days ago, which has brought the most heartening results. Actually, it surprised me also, because they also went into Taliban controlled areas to take a poll on what sort of Afghanistan people want to have. Even in Taliban-controlled area, the support for Taliban did not go beyond 10%. Nationally, it was less than 7% for a Taliban regime, or even going back to a strict Sharia regime, because the people today, while they are sort of conservative, religiously minded, but they're also very well connected and aware, and particularly the youth. And Afghanistan's, I think, that is the biggest asset it has, it's its youth. So, from our perspective, we feel that the biggest setback of Taliban coming back would be basically fall on two categories of people: women and the youth, and especially the educated youth. And I think India has invested a hell of a lot in the future generation of Afghanistan in terms of scholarship. Today, we count over 60,000 Afghans who have graduated from Indian universities, and we don't want that asset, or that asset of Afghanistan, to be lost to Afghanistan itself. Forget about losing it to India. What is the role that we can play, even in religious terms? Of course, we have never articulated it. And mind you, Dr. Malik, today I am also, don't speak for government. I'm out of government for 3 years, so I don't know whether I can't even qualify as an academic. So I'm more as a think tank speaker. See, the role of Islam and its interpretation, even Taliban, many of them still look up to Deoband in India, which was really the fountainhead of the Islamic theology. So I think we have not used that moderate theology and interpretation of Islam. And as a policy, we should be looking at that and making them interact with some of the Taliban leadership, especially their mullahs, so that they start looking and interpreting Islam in a manner which is slightly more modern, more contemporary, and perhaps even global. And I'm sure it is true for so many Islamic nations. Then, and of course, importantly, we have to necessarily insulate Afghanistan peace process from pulls and pushes of various regional dynamics and the evolving geopolitics. Because I have seen many arguments where people say that, oh, Kashmir should be resolved, and Xinjiang should be resolved, or Palestine should be resolved. If we wait for that, it's never going to happen. It's as real as that, in a sense. And the fact that when you say that the India-Pakistan rivalry, that's a narrative which has been pushed. I have never believed, and at least I don't think anybody in India believes, that Afghanistan has much to do with India-Pakistan relations, because we see that different. Of course, there's an element of geopolitical competition, and that is absolutely fair. You can see geopolitical competition between Japan, India, and China in Bangladesh. But that's all for positive. They're all investing in ports, infrastructure, etc. They're trying to get influence. So, and in this way, I don't belittle. In fact, most Afghans and most of us who understand the region understand the positive role that Pakistan has played. And many Afghans feel indebted for the shelter that they got as refugees. But why is it that this goodwill has not translated into policies? And this is where I think there is a disconnect between the Pakistani people and the, I won't even say the government, perhaps a coterie which runs Pakistan's foreign policy, unfortunately. And that's a reality which I will have consensus across the board. And this is not to criticize you. Well, that's how the society has evolved, or how the power structures have evolved. And that's something that more than us, all of you have to live with. See, when does India-Pakistan disputes get projected into Afghan problem? See, at the time of independence, India Jammu and Kashmir dispute starts with 47, 48, right? At that time, I don't think there was Afghanistan was perhaps the better off countries in the region than all of us together. And we did not have the issue. This issue gets projected onto Afghanistan only in 89, 91, when Russia withdraws, and there are these jihadi elements which are free-floating, mercenaries which are available, and a proven tactic of using political Islam and jihadists against governments, and that is when the problem begins. Uh, and even when we resolve, and you see, ultimately, what is India saying to Pakistan? That we are going to engage. We have always wanted to engage. In fact, despite my own I was squirming when Prime Minister Modi from Kabul decided to go to Lahore, because in terms of optics, it was very bad as ambassador then in Kabul. But anyway, he decided because he said that it's a chance we have to take, and I think a peaceful, uh, prosperous region would be good for all of us. So I don't think that this narrative has been pushed. Basically, I feel that it's more of a justification for certain policies which have continued in terms of whether giving sanctuary support to even if it's called the old generation of Taliban, to them. Ultimately, they still have the leadership. The shuras are there. The fighters could be the new generation. Of course, fighters are all 18 years, 19 years old. Some of the Taliban leaders haven't been in Afghanistan or on the battlefield for over 20 years. They have been in jails or in Doha. So I feel that there could be a disconnect, and I agree that perhaps not every group in Taliban people would be able to control. But as far as we can minimize, and then the main Taliban leadership also joins hands with Afghan people in stopping this violence, I think there will be progress. So I think the best help that the regional countries can do is to let Afghans deal with it themselves, but also keep their hands off in terms of meddling. Don't try to dictate an end state. It is, I think, best is to follow the Afghan public opinion, whatever the Afghans themselves, because while they have ability to fight, I also believe that Afghans have tremendous ability to make compromises and actually come to a solution. If we did that seriously and not just lip service, I think Doha agreement, despite the faults that Americans have committed, but they committed it because it was their political exigency. I feel that there is a hope that this can lead to something good. So I will stop at that. On CEPC, while of course Pakistan is a major proponent and India is, we are not at all against regional connectivity. In fact, we are all for it. But see, regional connectivity then cannot be selective and it cannot be through disputed areas. And that is our main objection to BRI, whatever name you call it. But China definitely is absolutely capable and free to build infrastructure in Afghanistan, as India has done, or Pakistan can come and build it because it is the requirement of the economy and the nation, and I don't think India will object. CPC, while it sounds very good, it's a great initiative, but people, I think, even in Pakistan, the debate on the economic and financial stability, sustainability is on. I don't know how many countries will be able to actually sort of afford it, let's put it this way, without getting into a debt burden. And we have seen the differences. You've seen the backlash in Africa. You've seen what happened in Maldives or in Sri Lanka. So while definitely infrastructure is a requirement, but there is an inherent capacity of any economy to sustain a certain level of debt or a certain level of investment. That has to be kept in mind. And I think basically a good, prudent decision, a financially prudent decision would be most welcome. So I would stop it at that. On Taliban, my own little interactions with webinars, we haven't met directly, is that they are not showing signs of any change, particularly when it comes to women. They are very clear. In fact, their former Minister of Justice was on a webinar 2-3 days ago. He mentioned on issues, he was asked specifically by both, in fact, a Pakistani interlocutor, and he says, because the Pakistani lady, I forget her name, she asked a question that, how would you insist on Mehram? We are saying that, Hudud laws will be implemented, etc. When half of Afghan women are widows and many of them don't have men. Oh, he said we will issue them new passes or that's some strange and quite disturbing sort of an answer. I also asked him that, I have lived there. Afghanistan is an Islamic state. It is a fairly religious state. What is it that you would want to change to make it even more Islamic? Then, of course, he only talked about good governance and anti-corruption, but he also said that all the television channels will have to stop because that has really corrupted our people. So I guess Afghans would also be deprived of watching the latest hot favorite in Pakistan. I think Ertugrul or something is the most favorite series, or Ertugrul will pass their muster maybe. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to further discuss with all of you any issue that you have.
Perfect.
Over to you, Rajeshwari.
Thank you, Ambassador Sinha, for that overview and for touching upon various aspects of the issues that came up today. Let me start with a few questions that came up in my mind as all of you spoke. I'll take the questions in reverse. Since Ambassador Sinha, you just concluded, what would India's red line be when it comes to the IAN? Do we have a red line? I mean, of course, we are not necessarily particularly engaging. By we, I mean India. I mean, I'm not speaking for government. But India has sort of participated in the inaugural session and so on and so forth. But as it stands, do we have a red line? Does India have a red line?
See, ultimately, it's Afghan peace negotiations. So for India to have red lines, I think it will be a bit presumptuous. But yes, personally speaking, I think some of the elements that Mr. Farasu already mentioned would be a red line, not only for us, but for most of the world, which is basically a certain internal balance. While there is no exact mathematical formula to have a balance, I think it is captured by the word that an inclusive and representative form of government. How do you choose that government is important. Only red line would be that it cannot be imposed by force or through weapons. Second, that it has to be a consultative process. Now, whether you do it through a vote or through jirga, I don't know. Ultimately, Afghans will have to find their own balance there. Second, the collapse of institutions. All the institutions that have been built over the last 20 years, if we see that as going, I think it will be a red line. But ultimately, you see, I think India would live with any formula or any combination which is acceptable to the Afghan people. And so both the end state, how that end state is reached, what sort of a government evolves, is something that we will be looking at. But any independent sovereign Afghan government, which is in control with its full territory, I think should be acceptable to most people. And that is what we are looking for. And I think somebody mentioned, I think Sugra Azizi mentioned that, India's concern remains that it should not become a launching pad for anti-India activities or for terror groups. I think that is a red line. So we would want any government which is in control, then it's control in full territory. Because our interests are defensive. We don't want Afghanistan as a launch pad for country X or Y. No, neither against us nor against anybody else. But we definitely don't want other terror groups operating in that penumbra of misgovernance or areas which are ungoverned. So that would be our basic red line. I don't think government of India has mentioned the red line.
Thank you, Ambassador Sinha. Dr. Malik wanted to have an intervention. Could you please?
Thank you, Rajeshwari. Thank you, Ambassador Sinha. You would make an excellent Afghan ambassador to anywhere in the world. I actually thought that your presentation was more to do with India-Afghanistan, but rather it was more a rebuttal to what all I had said. However, where I do agree with many things that you have said, I have really no qualms whether this is an exercise where to corner someone or anything, but few things need to stand corrected. Number one, the disputed area that you are mentioning is a bilaterally disputed area, that is the occupied, which includes the Indian occupied areas of Jammu and Kashmir, which the Indian government has unilaterally, as of the last 1 year, annexed, normalized, and changed its special status, which was in their constitution and not any other country's constitution. Pakistan has so far held the Kashmiri and the Gilgit-Baltistan area that it had in its side across the LOC still as per the UN provisions. However, let's hope we are not talking about India and Pakistan as this particular dialogue has become. I was looking forward to listening to your excellent views on India-Afghanistan cooperation, not a rebuttal to Pakistan, what Pakistan can do and has done. What I had proposed about the CPEC was a horizontal line, and I really couldn't locate any disputed areas along the horizontal grid through which the CPEC could pass, but I stand corrected. Unfortunately, Prime Minister Modi's Christmas visit or the birthday trip, whatever we would call it, may have been an exercise in good faith, but that did not really sink in very well when it came to the Pakistani calculations of what and how it had happened. And I think these things really need to take a lot of thought process, and I'm sure it wasn't a very instinctive exercise on Prime Minister Modi. He's a very, very articulate and a very strong politician who has a deep insight into many things. So I wish it had been that. Pakistan is not dictating anyone, contrary to what you have said. And I totally agree with everyone, whether it's Madam Azizi, you. We don't want Afghanistan to be a proxy ground against our interest as well. We are next door to Afghanistan, you are not. So we have genuine concerns the way you would have concerns in Bhutan and Nepal. So for Pakistan, Afghanistan, unfortunately, if it becomes a proxy field, launch pad for anything, whether they are Muslim terrorists, whether they are Afghan nationals, Pakistan nationals, foreign nationals being used for any negative activity that spills over into the region. Let me assure you, Pakistan is not such a bad country that we would support such a thing. There are many things that are happening in the region that can be talked about, but that's not the purview of this particular webinar. So it would take things in a very different direction. I think we were partnered to the same webinar that you were mentioned. It was Madam Amara Durrani who had asked a question more on the security sector. And I think that is one area that you have talked about in greater length, where India has done great work in promoting Afghan security sector, which is a very welcoming thing. It were two Afghan parliamentarian legislators who had asked about the women's role, participation, and how the widows, which are in a huge number in Afghanistan, what will happen to them. I really hope and pray that your optimism, given your prudence, proves to be right. But somehow, perhaps being young, we haven't, slightly younger than you, we haven't really seen or interacted with these people in person the way you have in your capacity. But I fear that perhaps the coming days are more challenging than what we have faced in the last decade plus in Afghanistan, and the consequences could unfortunately be really bad for Afghanistan and rest of the region, including Pakistan, India. It's going to be challenging. I hope where I look at the Taliban's, this generation of Taliban as wise economic actors, they also turn out to be shrewd political agents, and they try to make things look better. And the lens of legitimacy that they have been given, they also translate into a popular legitimacy. If that happens, but the biggest concern, of course, is the point that you have also pointed out, and that is how they treat women. That's a massive litmus test. And that consequence is going to have a massive spillover effect. Thank you so much, Rajeshwari.
Sorry, Rajeshwari, you're on mute.
Sorry. All right. Thank you, Dr. Malik. It was great to hear your perspective on. I think this is the kind of conversation we need to have more, so that at least we sort of our different points of view are not only stated but then also clarified. So thank you for that, Dr. Malik. Mr. Farasu had some remarks to make. We are really running out of time, so could you keep it to maybe a few minutes, if that's all right? I'm really sorry.
Oh, thank you. Just a few points. I think I'm also speaking here as a private citizen, so I'm not representing the Afghan government. So I think we need to speak frankly about policies in our region and policies that have victims in the region, particularly in Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, we have more than 42 years of war and violence. So it's the time to talk very frankly, and we should not take each other's position as somehow offensive or things like that. So we should frankly talk about those issues that we have. At the same time, as an Afghan, we have also concern about the radicalization in Pakistan and its impacts, and that I see that as kinds of social and cultural blowback in the country. And also what I'm talking about Pakistan, I'm not talking about Pakistan people or Pakistan as a whole. We're talking about our governments and policymakers. And we have a long border with Pakistan and social and cultural commonalities. So certainly the future should be based on cooperation and friendship, and mainly on economic issues and economic projects to help our people in both Afghanistan and Pakistan and in the region. So that's our future. The future is not this situation that we have right now. So, but to go forward, to move on, so we need to talk about security issues that we have. This is one. And the second point I would like to talk about is that mainly we're talking that so Taliban or other groups, they have their own agencies, they have their own autonomy. Yes, certainly Taliban is an ideological movement. They have their own political agendas. That's why they are fighting for types of political system that they believe and they think that's good for Afghanistan. So at the same, but there's power relation, and proxy relation is not in that classic way, in that classic fashion that we had in the past during the Cold War, at kinds of passive agent relation that we have had in the past. This quite a dynamic relation, and there is levels of autonomy, levels of it's more like a mutual enterprise. So and there is a policy and policy objectives behind that. And I think if we really want to talk about a good future and cooperation, then we have to address these issues frankly, and we talk about that, how we can solve that and how we can move beyond this problem that we have right now and that kinds of security problem that exists. And the bottom line is here, the question is that according to Afghanistan history and its impact, negative impact on the region, as Dr. Salman Malik mentioned, that the refugee went to Pakistan and those kinds of problems that we have in the region. So the main point is to how avoid state collapse or state interruption in Afghanistan. That was a huge crisis in Afghanistan history. So the peace process and security agendas in the region should not lead in that direction to result kinds of state or institutional collapse or interruption in the country. And that will lead to another civil war, and that will lead to another crisis in the region. And we all agree on that the crisis in Afghanistan impact the region negatively, whether it's a security issue, refugee, radicalization, women's rights, whatever we think about. So the underlying point is how we all think about that to avoid that situation. And to do that, basically, we as private citizens talking about policies, about different alignments in the region, different strategies, different ambitions, and different scenarios that we can think and can talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Farasu. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but I'm happy that we ended on a note from a speaker from Afghanistan. Mariam, would you like to sort of take it from here?
Thank you very much, Rajeshwari, and thank you to all of our speakers. It's been an extremely enriching discussion, and and I must say lots of very new insights as to where India and Pakistan and Afghanistan are positioned within the talks that are happening in Doha, and what are their perspectives on those talks. From lots of very interesting points have been raised, and I'm just going to briefly highlight a few of those that I think are worth us taking a more deeper look beyond this webinar. I'm very thankful to Mr. Farasu for really setting the parameters of the talks by presenting to us those 5 scenarios that could potentially evolve from these talks. There was the maximum balanced approach, or the maximum level of strategic push that can be placed, where what will happen is us seeing the Taliban return to power through this peace process and with no concessions. That's one particular scenario that could emerge. Second is an integrative balanced scenario, which would change the political landscape in Afghanistan, where both sides of the table would fuse their political thinkings and the way they'd like the state to be formed, but one which has this pending threat where we could see the Taliban slowly over time seep through more and more elements of the Islamic Emirate into this type of system. And this is one that still instills a bit of fear in Afghanistan, is this integrative balanced approach. Then we've got a minimum internal balanced approach, which is a bit similar, and I agree with Mr. Farasu. It's very similar to what we have right now, where what we would see is the Taliban controlling their territory and the Afghan state controlling their territory. That is something that we have to a certain extent happening right now, but of course there's territory that is contested as well. Then there is failure of the peace process, which would take us into a civil war, and that is of course the absolute and utter worst case scenario at this moment. And then fifth, we have got an enduring peace agreement, and that's the ideal scenario, of course. It's a scenario in which an agreement would be able to uphold the principles and the integrity of the current democratic institutions we have in Afghanistan. In terms of what we need to avoid, as Mr. Farasu outlined, is to prevent an internal collapse of the Afghan state. And for that, a regional consensus is required, within which Pakistan and India play an absolutely crucial role. Second, and this was a point highlighted by other speakers as well, focus on the economic and regional, both bilateral economic and also regional economic initiatives, both to help strengthen the Afghan state in this process. Afghanistan is now going to be, in November, we have a pledging conference that is going to be coming up, and all eyes are on this pledging conference to see how we can, how the international community will now offer its development in Afghanistan for the next 4 years, and also how this aid can be used as a leverage to ensure that the Taliban negotiating team remain committed, or commit and then remain committed to it, to promises of respecting the rights of Afghans and supporting Afghan public opinion, as Ambassador Sinha had mentioned, for a democratic state. And Dr. Malik, I'm really thankful to you for pointing out to us that, you know, Afghanistan and Pakistan did have relations before the entry of the Taliban on the scene. And of course, the relationship has had its ups and downs, but you rightly pointed that both have had trouble since the creation of Pakistan, which has caused a trade deficit that was then, of course, exploited with the entry of the Taliban in the 90s. And I thank you for discussing this new generation of Taliban and this old generation of Taliban. This has been an ongoing discussion also within Afghanistan as well, of the new and the old and the number one and the number two. And I think there's truth to this difference. The new generation does differ quite a lot from the previous. The old, as you pointed out, was more dependent on Pakistan, whereas the new, or the second generation of Taliban, which is now vying to come to power through the Doha process, is a hardened people who claim significant territory in Afghanistan, and that has given them absolutely a sense of great confidence and arrogance. Stakeholders, as you have pointed out, is negotiating directly with the Taliban, and they are they are, as you pointed out, also more economically concerned, and they are open to any state, whether that be Pakistan or India or China or Russia or whomever, that can provide them that economic support. And for that, we do see a change. And they often talk about supporting, maintaining and strengthening regional cooperation and bilateral ties, especially economic. The challenges you pointed out, Dr. Malik, which have been highlighted by other panelists, that you've been seeing coming out of the peace process, is the shrinking space for civil society. And as a member of civil society, I cannot agree more with you on that. It's already shrunk, and if this process continues in the manner it is continuing, we will have no space for civil society ultimately in this process. And of course, the threat to women's rights. That is a very pertinent matter, and it's one that is very concerning for all in Afghanistan, and hence the women's movement in Afghanistan has been working tirelessly for years now to try to make sure that their rights within the constitution are not overhauled in this process. The international community, once again, another point that was also stressed by Ambassador Sinha as well, is that the international community has strengthened the Taliban's position on the table right now. And this strength and this leverage that has given the Taliban means that it has taken away something from the Afghan state on that table. And this unbalanced position of the international community on the table, particularly the United States, has provided an incredibly viable I guess, set of circumstances for the Taliban, which the Afghan state or the Afghan negotiating team and the Republic do not have. And this needs to be something that has to be looked at and corrected if we want to have what Mr. Faraso said, which was an enduring peace agreement. And in terms of prospects, you've pointed out that the economic prospects, and you've also discussed CPAC, though we recognize CPAC is, of course, a topic and an initiative that I don't believe might bring that horizontal proposition of where Pakistan and India and Bangladesh and all countries can engage in and benefit from its. We did a recent study on this under our BRI study, and we do see lots of prospects for Afghanistan linking itself to CPAC, and it's also looked at as a viable option by Afghan policymakers as well. But India's position within this does make it difficult for Afghan policymakers to really jump on to this initiative as of yet, unless something changes here within Afghanistan, within Pakistan and India's vision towards CPAC and the BRI. Ambassador Sinha, thank you so much for your remarks. Thank you for really making clear the relationship between the security relationship between Afghanistan and India, and how it has been and how it is still right now. As you pointed out, India has had a need-based security relationship with Afghanistan, and NATO has had the primary responsibility, of course, over the years. And those countries that are not a part of the NATO establishment in Afghanistan who are then not involved heavily in the training and the equipping, it means that with India has plugged the gaps within the security apparatus in the last 2 decades since the intervention, rather than being able to provide the type of security assistance that it wanted to, because as you pointed out, that space was limited, and so. The strong cooperation that Afghanistan and India had in terms of intelligence sharing is also another key element of the security bilateral relations between the two countries, and one which Afghanistan has tried to build with Pakistan as part of its APAPS initiative, but has not really moved forward in the last few years. Another challenge that you had highlighted in terms of the bilateral security cooperation was that the U.S. policy towards Russia, China, and the region is a complicating factor in what the region can contribute in terms of the security apparatus in Afghanistan, and that India has thus centered it has catered to the defensive rather than the offensive requirements of the Afghan security institutions. And as you mentioned, training has also been a difficulty because of how much the Afghan state could spare in terms of its officers for such programs. In terms of how what India can do as part of the Doha process, you highlighted a few very important points. One was that India has followed Afghan public opinion, and that has been always the case, and that has been a position India has always stood very strongly upon. What the Afghan public wants to determine as its future and what it wants its peace process to reflect is what India supports. But you also rightly mentioned that one thing that India can do is to keep the political parties in Afghanistan together. By bringing them together on ensuring that they are not divisive, we could thus ensure stronger support for the Afghan negotiating team in the table. The last thing we want is the Taliban to see a divisive republic, and that can be very, very dangerous. And some of those consequences we can already see on the table. So we have to be able to regroup here. And in terms of a throwback to the Islamic Emirate, can't agree more with you that it would not be something that would be acceptable, of course, to India, and it would not be acceptable to the people of Afghanistan or the other regional countries, and for that matter, the people of Pakistan. So a throwback is something that I think that the worst scenario that Mr. Faraso had pointed out may not happen, because I trust that the people of Afghanistan would not accept that type of solution from the table. And civil society is doing as much as it can to ensure that those voices are raised on the table, though there's a lot of barriers in doing so. And as Dr. Malik had mentioned, that the Taliban are very arrogant about the amount of territory they control. They're also they also claim that the people that are under those territories they control are those who follow their thinking and are members of their civil society. Yet they have not been challenged as to actually show how that is. And I think it's time we do that. It's very important for us to now unpack this notion that we claim large swaths of territory and the people that are in those territory follow our ideals, hence we represent the majority. That time has come for us to really try to do that as best as we can. And very interestingly, in this discussion that we've had today, both Dr. Malik and Ambassador Sena and Mr. Faraso have pointed out that we must do everything we can to ensure the assets that we have in Afghanistan, and those assets are youth and women. This generation that has been quite empowered, a generation that is quite mobilized, a demographic that is quite mobilized in Afghanistan, and then we need to ensure that this is protected. And another commonality in your talking points was also that the position the United States has taken on the table has swayed support to one to one stakeholder on the table than the other, and we need to be able to correct this. And I think that I will end there. And once again, I'd like to, on behalf of my team at DROPS, I'd like to thank Ambassador Sena and Dr. Malik, Mr. Abbas Faraso, and Ms. Shukriya Azizi for sharing their views and being so open with us in this discussion, and Ms. Rajeshwari Krishnamurthy for moderating today's session. Always lovely to have you with us. Thank you. And I'd also like to point out that Ms. Krishnamurthy is the copy editor of our Women in Public Policy journal 6 years running, and she's an integral component of that journal and making it possible for us every single year. So thank you, Rajeshwari. Thank you, panelists. It was an absolute honor to have you all with us.
Thank you very much, Mariam.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.